The air in the alcove was thick with the scent of their mingled breaths, the heat of their bodies still radiating like a dying fire. Clara's heart thudded against her ribs, each beat a drumroll to the chaos she'd just unleashed. The man before her, his name still a mystery, watched her with eyes that seemed to see through to her very soul, his expression unreadable yet intense. He straightened, pulling his shirt back into place, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. "What now, Clara?" His voice was a low rumble, the question hanging between them like the last note of a song, fading into silence. She swallowed, the taste of him still on her lips, her mind racing. I don't know." Her voice was a whisper, lost in the enormity of what she'd just done. The reality of her betrayal to Thomas, to their life together, crashed over her like a cold wave. He stepped back, giving her space, yet his presence was overwhelming, his gaze a tether she couldn't break. "You have choices, Clara. You always have." The word choices echoed in her mind. Choices she hadn't considered in years, not since she'd settled into the predictable rhythm of her marriage. She glanced towards the door, where Thomas still conversed, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his reach. Her fingers brushed against the cool brick wall, grounding her. "I need to think," she said, more to herself than to him. He nodded, his smirk softening into something akin to understanding. "I'll be here when you're ready." With that, he turned, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the club, leaving her alone with her tumultuous thoughts. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, the silk of her dress now a mere whisper against her skin, feeling the chill of the night air seeping through the walls. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, guilt, exhilaration, fear, and a burgeoning sense of freedom. She stepped out of the alcove, her steps hesitant, her gaze darting back to where the mysterious man had disappeared. The club's atmosphere seemed different now, charged with an undercurrent of her own making. The music, once a comforting backdrop, now felt like a taunt, each note a reminder of her indiscretion. She moved towards the bar, her legs feeling like they might give way at any moment. As she approached, the bartender, a man with a knowing look in his eye, slid another glass of champagne towards her. "You look like you could use this," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Clara took the glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. The bubbles tickled her nose, a sharp contrast to the heaviness in her heart. She sipped, letting the alcohol numb the edges of her guilt. Her eyes wandered back to the door, where Thomas was still engaged in conversation. His laughter reached her ears, a sound that once brought her comfort, now it felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She knew she should go to him, tell him everything, but the words stuck in her throat, heavy with the weight of her actions. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the bar, catching the reflection of her flushed face in the mirror, behind the bottles. The woman staring back at her seemed both familiar and a stranger. A soft voice broke her reverie. "Everything okay, Clara?" It was Emily, her friend from the club, her eyes filled with concern as she approached. Clara forced a smile, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. "Just needed a moment," she replied, her words feeling hollow. Emily's gaze flicked towards the alcove, then back to Clara. "You've been gone for a while. Thomas was looking for you." The mention of Thomas sent a jolt through Clara. "I'll go to him now," she said, setting down her glass with a clink that sounded too loud in her ears. As she walked towards Thomas, each step felt like a march to her own judgment. Her heart pounded louder with every stride, the echo of her betrayal reverberating in her chest. She reached him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, to get his attention. Thomas turned, his face lighting up with a smile that made her heart ache. "There you are. I was starting to think you'd left without me." Clara's laugh was strained. "Never," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, his warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread settling in her stomach. "Let's get out of here, what do you say? A nightcap at home?" She nodded, her agreement automatic, her mind elsewhere. As they walked out, her eyes inadvertently sought the shadows where the man had vanished. There was no sign of him, but the memory of his touch, his kiss, lingered like a ghost, haunting her steps. The night air was crisp as they stepped outside, the stars indifferent to the turmoil within her. Thomas chatted about the club's business, oblivious to the storm brewing in Clara's heart. She responded with nods and half-hearted smiles, her thoughts consumed by the choices she now faced. The car ride home was silent, save for the hum of the engine and Thomas's occasional comments about the evening. Clara stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, mirroring the confusion in her mind. The car ride home was a blur, the silence between Clara and Thomas filled with the unspoken tension of her betrayal. Each streetlight they passed seemed to cast a judgmental glow over her, illuminating the turmoil within. Thomas, ever the oblivious partner, continued to talk about the night's successes, his voice a distant hum in Clara's ears. As they pulled into their driveway, the familiar sight of their home did little to comfort her. Instead, it stood as a monument to the life she was now questioning. Thomas turned off the engine, his hand reaching for hers, a gesture of affection that now felt like a chain. "Clara, you've been quiet all night. Something on your mind?" Thomas's voice was gentle, his concern genuine. She forced a smile, her heart racing. "Just tired," she lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "It was a long night." He nodded, accepting her excuse with a kiss on her forehead. "Let's get you to bed then." Inside, the house was quiet, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway a stark reminder of time moving forward, regardless of her internal chaos. Clara excused herself to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. She leaned against the sink, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, eyes wide with fear and longing. The sound of Thomas moving around in the bedroom brought her back to the present. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the guilt, but it clung to her like a second skin. When she returned to the bedroom, Thomas was already under the covers, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Come here," he beckoned, patting the space beside him. Clara slipped into bed, her body tense, every touch from Thomas now a reminder of her infidelity. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, and she lay there, rigid, her mind replaying the night's events. The next morning, the sunlight was harsh, unyielding. Clara awoke to find Thomas already up, the smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen. She dressed mechanically, her movements robotic, her thoughts elsewhere. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Thomas, engrossed in the morning paper, missed the storm brewing in her eyes. "I've got an early meeting today," he said, folding the newspaper. "But I'll be back for dinner. Maybe we can go out, just the two of us?" Clara nodded, her throat tight. "Sounds nice," she managed, her voice hollow. Once Thomas left, the silence of the house enveloped her. She wandered through the rooms, each one a testament to their shared life. Photos of their wedding, vacations, and anniversaries stared back at her, accusingly. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. *I hope you slept well, Clara. Remember, I'm here when you're ready. Her heart skipped a beat. The mystery man, his presence now infiltrating her sanctuary. She deleted the message, her hands shaking, but the words lingered in her mind, a siren call to her newfound desires. The day stretched endlessly. Clara tried to distract herself with chores, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the club, to the heat of the alcove, to the forbidden thrill of being wanted in such a raw, unfiltered way. By evening, Thomas returned, his mood upbeat, unaware of the tempest within his wife. They dressed for dinner, Clara choosing a dress that felt too much like armor. At the restaurant, the ambience was intimate, candles casting soft shadows, but all Clara could see was the silhouette of the man from the club. "You've been distant," Thomas remarked over their appetizers, his brow furrowed. "Is everything okay between us?" The question hung in the air, a loaded gun. Clara's fork paused midair. I've just been thinking a lot," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About what?" Thomas leaned in, his concern palpable. "About us, about life, about what I want," she confessed, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Thomas's expression shifted, a mix of confusion and hurt. Clara, if there's something you need, just tell me. We've always been open with each other. But how could she tell him? How could she explain the void she felt, the craving for something more, something different? The dinner continued with strained conversation, each word a step further into the abyss of her guilt. Back home, the tension was palpable. Thomas tried to bridge the gap with affection, but Clara recoiled, her body and mind at war. She excused herself early, claiming a headache, leaving Thomas alone in their shared space, his confusion turning into a quiet despair. In the solitude of their bedroom, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her phone in hand. The temptation to reply to the mystery man was overwhelming. Her thumb hovered over the screen, her heart pounding. The choice was hers, a crossroads of her own making. Stay in the predictable comfort of her marriage, or venture into the unknown with a man who promised nothing but the thrill of the forbidden. Her life, once so clear, was now a puzzle with pieces she didn't know how to fit together. As the night deepened, so did her resolve. She needed to confront what she felt, what she wanted. The truth was, she didn't know yet, but she knew she couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between duty and desire. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in with each breath Clara took. She stared at the phone, the screen's light casting an eerie glow on her face. The message from the mystery man was like a beacon in the fog of her confusion, beckoning her towards a path she knew was fraught with danger yet irresistibly alluring. Her fingers itched to type a response, to acknowledge the pull of the unknown, but she hesitated. The life she had built with Thomas was stable, secure, and filled with love, yet it lacked the spark, the fire that had ignited in her last night. She stood, pacing the room, her steps silent on the plush carpet. The house, once a haven, now felt like a cage. She walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to look out into the night. The street was quiet, the occasional car passing by, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Her mind was a battleground. On one side, the comfort of her marriage, the known, the safe. On the other, the thrill of the unknown, the passion that promised to consume her. She closed her eyes, the memory of his touch, his kiss, sending a shiver down her spine. The phone buzzed again, another message, I'm waiting, Clara. The choice is yours, Her heart raced, her resolve crumbling. She typed quickly, her fingers trembling. Meet me at the park. Midnight, The message sent, she felt a rush of adrenaline, a mix of fear and excitement. She knew this was the point of no return, the moment where her life could change irrevocably. Clara dressed in silence, choosing clothes that felt like armor against the cold night air and the colder reality of her decision. She left a note for Thomas, vague and noncommittal, saying she needed some air, some time to think. The park was a short walk, the path familiar, yet tonight it seemed different, charged with the electricity of her impending choice. The trees cast long shadows, the moonlight filtering through the leaves, creating a mosaic of light and dark on the ground. He was there, leaning against a tree, his silhouette unmistakable. As she approached, he straightened, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You came, he said, his voice a low, seductive drawl. I had to, Clara replied, her voice steady, despite the storm inside her. I needed to see you, to understand what this is. He stepped closer, the space between them charged with unspoken promises. This, he whispered, his hand reaching out to trace the line of her jaw, is whatever you want it to be. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through her. She should have stepped back, should have turned away, but instead, she leaned into his touch, her resolve crumbling like dry leaves underfoot. I want to feel alive, Clara breathed out, her voice a mix of defiance and desperation. His smile was slow, knowing. Then let's make you feel alive, Clara. Let's make this night unforgettable. He took her hand, leading her deeper into the park, away from the prying eyes of the world. The path was lit only by the moon, casting a silver glow that made everything seem ethereal, almost dreamlike. They reached a secluded bench, the kind where lovers whispered secrets and promises under the cover of darkness. Sitting down, Clara felt the cool wood beneath her, grounding her in the moment. He sat beside her, his presence overwhelming, his scent enveloping her in a cocoon of desire and danger. "Why me?" she asked, her voice, barely above a whisper, seeking some semblance of understanding in this whirlwind of emotion. He looked at her, his eyes dark pools of mystery. "Because you're different, Clara. You're not just another face in the crowd. You have a fire in you, one that's been smothered by the mundane. I saw it last night, and I want to fan those flames." His words were like a key, unlocking something deep within her. She felt a surge of power, of recognition. Here was someone who saw her, not the wife, not the dutiful partner, but her, the woman yearning for something more. They talked, or rather, he spoke, weaving tales of his life, his travels, his conquests, each story more enticing than the last. Clara listened, her heart racing not just from the content but from the way he spoke, with a voice that seemed to caress her soul. As the night deepened, so did their connection. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining, a simple gesture that felt like a promise. The air was thick with anticipation, with the unspoken question of what would happen next. "You're not going back to him, are you?" His voice was soft, but the question was pointed, demanding an answer she wasn't sure she had. Clara looked away, her gaze lost in the shadows of the park. I don't know," she admitted. "I love him, but you want more," he finished for her, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You want to live, not just exist." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She nodded, tears pricking at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of her own desires. He stood, pulling her up with him. "Then come with me, Clara. Let's leave this place, this life, this routine, and find something real, something that makes you feel alive." Clara's breath hitched. The choice was stark, the path before her fraught with uncertainty. She looked back towards the direction of her home, the life she knew, then back at him, the embodiment of the unknown. Her heart was a tempest, torn between the comfort of the familiar and the allure of the forbidden. "I can't just leave," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her decision. "There's so much at stake." He took a step closer, his presence a magnetic force. "But you can choose, Clara. You can choose to break free from the chains of expectation, from the life that's been laid out for you. You can choose to live for yourself." The night air was cool, the park silent except for the distant hum of the city. Clara felt the pull of his words, the promise of a life less ordinary. Yet, the thought of Thomas, of the vows they'd made, the life they'd built, anchored her. "I need time," she said, her voice firming with resolve. "I need to understand what I truly want." He nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. But remember, Clara, life waits for no one. When you're ready, I'll be here." With that, he stepped back, giving her the space to think, to feel. Clara watched him retreat into the shadows, his figure becoming one with the night. She sat back down on the bench, the cold seeping through her clothes, grounding her in the reality of her situation. The hours passed, and Clara remained there, her thoughts a whirlwind. She thought of Thomas, his steady love, his unwavering support. She thought of the man from the club, the fire he ignited within her, the raw, unfiltered passion. As dawn approached, the first light of morning began to filter through the trees, casting a soft glow on the park. Clara stood, her decision not yet made but her path clearer. She knew she couldn't continue living in this limbo, this half-life of guilt and desire. She walked back to her home, the streets now waking up, the world moving forward. Entering her house, she found Thomas asleep on the couch, the TV still murmuring in the background. He must have waited up for her. Her heart ached at the sight of him, so vulnerable, so trusting. Clara sat beside him, watching him sleep, her mind replaying the night's events. She knew she had to confront him, to lay bare the turmoil within her. But not now, not while he was asleep, not while she was still so conflicted. The morning light grew stronger, and Thomas stirred, his eyes fluttering open to meet hers. "Clara," he mumbled, confusion and sleep mingling in his voice. I'm here, she said softly, her voice steady, despite the storm inside. We need to talk. Thomas sat up, rubbing his eyes, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. What's wrong? Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding. I've been feeling lost, Thomas. Last night, I did something that I regret, something that made me question everything. Thomas's face paled, the realization dawning. What did you do, Clara? She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I met someone. I was unfaithful. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas's expression was a mix of pain and disbelief. Why, was all he managed to say. Because I felt like I was suffocating, Clara confessed, tears now streaming down her face. I felt like I was losing myself in the routine, in the predictability. I needed to feel something, anything. Thomas stood, pacing, his hands running through his hair. And you think this betrayal will help you find yourself? No, Clara shook her head, her voice breaking. I realize now that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But it opened my eyes to what I've been missing, what we've been missing. He stopped pacing, looking at her with a mix of anger and sorrow. So, what now? Do we just pretend this didn't happen? No, Clara said firmly. I want to work on us, on our marriage. I want to find that spark again, together. But I also need to find myself, not just as your wife, but as Clara. Thomas sat back down, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I need time, Clara. Time to think, to process this. She nodded, understanding the gravity of her actions. I'll give you all the time you need. But know this, Thomas, I love you. I want to make this right, if you'll let me. The room was heavy with the weight of their conversation, the future uncertain. Clara knew she had to make amends, to rebuild what she had fractured. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was determined to face them, to find a balance between her desires and her commitments. As Thomas left the room, Clara sat alone, the silence now a companion in her reflection. She had chosen not to run away with the mystery man, but instead to confront her life, her choices, and her heart. The path to redemption, to understanding, was long, but she was ready to walk it, step by painful step, with or without Thomas by her side. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.